we are going to be discussing, the title of today's show is Astrologers Who've Predicted Their Own Death. Now, this topic is a bit controversial because many people might have some adverse reactions to hearing that one could possibly predict their own death. And
so fair warning here.
Yes, it could be seen as a kind of morbid topic. However, I can speak my personal position to this is that to me, it's an interesting one. And really, I wanted to showcase two really great, well-known, established astrologers who contributed a lot to the field and were very impressive in their predictive abilities to the point where they even predicted their own demise. Now, it's not to say I condone people, reaching out to astrologers for this particular reason. And it's not even something I personally explore in my own chart. But it's a very interesting topic and it presents very interesting evidence for astrology. Now,
let me intro my own take on that real quick.
Sure.
And we could share what we're each going to share because we're each going to do different astrologers. So for me, this is something in astrology where, astrologers have predicted their own death. And this is not situations where these people were really sick or something on their deathbed, which can usually be predicted by horary astrology, or is, which is a little more psychic and metaphysical in a way, or some people claim. But this is like healthy astrologers, like doing fine, looking at their charts and saying, oh, wow, I got to watch out for this period here. And we'll go through, me and Molly are going to go do our own take because we each studied a different astrologer who predicted their own death. For me, I'm going to go over Grant Lewi and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show his chart. I'm going to look at the aspects prior to his death, after, and I'm going to talk about a little about my own moral take on this situation or this prediction method, especially in contrast to mundane astrology, which can override it. Mundane astrology would be like large catastrophes, tsunamis that take out millions of people or something, which obviously would override any personal chart prediction. And then how about you, Molly? What are you going to share?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to talk on a well-known astrologer, Evangeline Adams. She was an late 19th, early 20th century astrologer. And she's really responsible for adding a lot of validity to the craft, to the science, really, is what she argued it was. And she did happen to predict that she would no longer be with us. And so there were certain commitments that were asked of her to do a tour, a book, some sort of a lecture tour, maybe. And she said, you know what, I'm probably not going to be around to make it. And she did pass away. So it was it's really interesting. I want to talk a little on just who she was as an astrologer, some of her famous predictions, how she made her mark in the world of astrology, and then ultimately what her death was, and then looking at, it wasn't published, the precise calculation she did to predict her death, but I'm going to pull the date of death chart and also her progressions chart and kind of give my own astrological insight into maybe what the transits were that ultimately let her carry on to this next phase.
All right, let's do it.
Cool. So I'll begin. My astrologer is Evangeline Adams. She was loosely a distant relative of the President Adams, who her family, a very prominent Boston family, kind of, I don't want to say disowned, but they definitely had their reservations about her astrological career and practice, though she definitely proved herself within the field of astrology. She became the event that got her well recognized was predicting this event called the Windsor Fire. She had a client who was the owner of this Windsor hotel, and she, I think, even used the space to see clients in. And she actually read his chart and looked at the transits and was like, there's going to be a really intense event happening like soon, like right now even. And I think it was the next day that
Did
his
she
hotel.
say where? Did she say where he was living?
I don't remember the details of if she said like I don't think she specifically said a fire, but she just said there's going to be like an emergency like now. Like these transits are looking bad for something extreme to be going down. And the next day his hotel caught on fire. He obviously was fine, but it was very validating to what she shared. I'm gonna just share her chart for everyone to look at so we can get a little.
Can I ask a quick question about Bowl of Heaven, her biography?
Totally, yeah. I love
So in there's, because I just read a little, and apparently there's a situation where she, it was an early prediction where something, I guess she was going somewhere, and she would take horse there, and she knew something would go wrong that day. She knew her astrology. She was pretty young, I think, and instead she took a mule, and the mule ended up acting up. I guess she took the mule because horses can be a little more tempestuous. And she took the mule, and the mule apparently like freaked out, and she broke her leg. Do you remember this story in Bowl of Heaven?
I do. I read that book a little while ago, a few months ago, so it's not so fresh in my mind right now. But yeah, there's so many instances. That's a great book. It's your biography of her clients. She had very many well-known prominent clients. One of them was James Pierpont Morgan, who consulted her. She was taught under a financial astrologer, and she was also taught under 2 homeopathic astrologers. So these were astrologers who used astrology in relation to medicine.
All doctors did prior to a certain year, for sure.
Correct.
Doctors were homeopathic.
She also studied Vedanta, and she studied under a Hindu Swami. So she had a very well-rounded kind of mentorship with astrology, and that was how she was trained. And obviously she did a lot of walk-ins, like and her big thing, I looked up her human design. She was a generator, I'm pretty sure. Maybe she was a manifesting generator. I know she was a generator of some type. And when you read this book, you're like, wow, she saw a ton of clients, and she was all about efficiency. Her readings didn't last more than like 15 minutes. And she would just get into like what they needed to hear. And she used this technique called the accidental ascendant. And it talks about it in Bowl of Heaven, where she would look at the ascendant when the person came into her office, what was on the rise. And she would cast the chart of the person as if that sign that was currently rising when they're meeting her was their ascendant. And then
that was a common thing back then. I mean, especially after her, astrologers got into that. Go ahead. So
she had all these prominent clients. She ended up, by the time she did demise, her estate was worth 2 million in today's money conversion standards. She was charging $50 an half hour for readings, which by today's standard, you would think that's not a lot, but back then $50 you could buy a 3-piece furniture set. So like,
so that's like equivalent of what, maybe 800
exactly.
For half an hour.
Yeah, almost like $1,000 by today's standard. Back then she was charging that. Yeah, but she was good.
There's human design analysis that charge that much, you know what I mean, like, for sure.
Well, and she also
there's astrologers that charge that much too. There are, of course.
She had a radio show. She had 3 books that were out. A lot of her books are more on, unfortunately for me as like an astrologer reading them, I was a little disappointed because they're more on kind of like sun sign astrology, and they're very kind of general, but that's good. That's what actually I think led to her popularity, because she can make it accessible, but she doesn't go so much into like really nerdy specific techniques. But there's this book that I read about her called What Evangeline Adams Knew by Karen Cristino. And she basically researched her life, researched some of her clients more in depth, and she kind of alludes to some of what Evangeline's techniques were. So this is the best I could do it, kind of like learning more of her techniques. And she also has this pamphlet Evangeline wrote that
was well, that's great, because the common problem is like people don't share techniques, you know what I mean? They just do cookbook astrology, and then
that's the thing, like Evangeline never wrote her own techniques, spelled them out.
Another astrologer who hides their knowledge, which is
fine. I don't know that she hid it, but she just like in her Bowl of Heaven, she talks about the accidental ascendant technique. And that's kind of her main juice that she gives on
But
her
that's
own.
not hers alone. Again, that was used widely during late after her times. That was used by Grant
I
Lewi.
believe she's the one that brought that into
Yeah,
popularity.
again, I'm not surprised, and I was already like hinting towards that, but I'm just saying that I guess you're right. That's one method, that one technique that maybe became established because of her. But I'm sure she's using others, right? With that book you're reading, what Adams knew.
Yeah, it really goes into some of her well-known client readings based on transcripts. Unfortunately, there's no records of that show. Like, we can't listen to that radio show. I wish we could. She would have people call in and answer questions, but there is no remaining records of that. So we just have her books, and we have the people who nerded out to her, like this woman, who've done some research. So I pulled up her chart, Evangeline Adams' chart. Can you see it, Maria?
Yeah, I can see it clear.
Cool.
I'm already reading it
Awesome.
through.
Yeah, so some striking things about her. So her most famous kind of claim to fame in the world of astrology is that she was actually in court being accused of fortune telling, which back in the day in New York State was considered a crime because there were a lot of swindlers that were manipulating people, saying, oh, I can read your fortune, and just kind of swindling them out of money. It's not to attack clairvoyance or channelers or people who do have those gifts. But back then there was more of like a hesitancy to those crafts because there were people mixed in who didn't really know what they're doing. And there's the same thing with astrologers, you could argue. But what Evangeline showed in court is that astrology, she was also doing palmistry at the time, but she at least could demonstrate that the astrology she did was of coming from mathematical calculations, and that was rooted in some larger reference and research. And she wasn't just kind of pulling statements out of the thin air. She was actually rooting it in some observable patterns. So she raised astrology to being seen as a science, at least through the court. So they dismissed her of the charges of fortune telling. And so I think that's really groundbreaking, because even today, so many people make the assumption that like, when you're doing astrology, they confuse it with other modalities even, and they might think that you're doing some other sort of channeling and other sort of intuition. And I would say, I firmly believe that astrology is both. Like, yes, you're drawing the calculations, but you're also using your intuition to translate what the meanings of these placements might hint at. And so Evangeline was funny because she had a quote that said, I'm just doing math. I'm not doing anything more than that. And I would argue that she was, because she also had the gift of palmistry. And if you look at her chart, she had Neptune on the ascendant. And I believe she got a lot of information, even though maybe she doesn't admit to it. I believe a lot of her information was intuitive, psychic, channeled as well. But her public kind of expression around it was really arguing, hey, this is a valid craft and it should be seen as something we can observe and measure and test. And in her chart also, you notice she has Pluto in the second house. I think that led to also her being able to make a lot of money. Pluto and Taurus in the second house, that was her power. She could make a lot of money and have a lot of material security through this art form of Aquarius sun. It's not uncommon to see Aquarius sun, moon, personal planets of astrologers, because the planet Uranus actually rules astrology. So we see some little signatures here in her chart, kind of glimpses into her life. She had a Leo moon as well, and was kind of known to like want to be part of the high society, taking clients that were of well-known stature. So there was something kind of regal in, I think, how she became like a prominent astrologer and even became a millionaire astrologer, which isn't really something we like hear of. We tend to think of like these spiritual or healing paths as being more like a martyr path where you're just helping. And some people even believe, in some cultures, the people believe, shouldn't be charged when you do astrology. Like it
Oh
should
yeah,
be
for
something
sure.
you do for free. But as we can see in her chart, it was more her destiny to make money out of it and become kind of a figurehead within the path.
Yeah, that's all great information, and very interesting. I just want to add, look at Chiron right there on her ascendant. I mean, the wounded healer archetype, the shaman archetype for the whole chart right there, with it right there on the ascendant. Neptune in the first you already discussed. Plus, is it in? Oh, no, it's in Aries. I thought it was in Pisces for a minute. And let's see what else I was gonna say. Saturn in the eighth. Good with other people's money. Good in investing. Good in handling money. And is that opposing Pluto in the second? I think so. That would have been powerful as well. And then Pluto in the second, as you said, I mean, that's someone who desperately does not want to be poor, from almost fear of poverty, they're making as much money as they can. Like Pluto in the second is really intense in terms of survival.
That makes sense.
Pluto's fear. Pluto's operating through fear anyway. Wherever Pluto is in our chart is where we have to work through that fear, to its source, right? And transform it, and disintegrate it.
So it's our power at the end of the day. It's interesting.
And then,
go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna add, she was actually born into a really wealthy family. Like her father was a millionaire, but then he lost a lot of his money before he passed away when she was 2. He passed away when she was 2. So wealth was kind of just something you could say was like more fated in her chart.
Well, sudden changes at the home, Uranus in the fourth, right? And then North Node in the sixth, here to serve others, right? South Node in the 12th. So yeah, she was here to be in service to others. And then she's got the moon there too. And then look at all that 12th house action. She's in the underworld doing all this work, calculating, right? And then nuancing it with her psychic perceptive abilities. Yeah, very interesting chart. Very she's working all those angles. All the planets are working together,
Definitely. And some of her well-known, as I mentioned, it was that Windsor fire, her public court case, kind of always being kind of in the public eye with this astrology stuff. And she also was predicted a lot of the war. She didn't live to see World War II. She passed away before, but she made predictions alluding to those dates being when the war would happen. And she based that off of looking at Uranus and Uranus cycles. And every 84 years, Uranus goes through all of the signs. Particularly what she observed is that when Uranus is in Gemini, which it would have been in 1942 when he entered that, and obviously we know that's when World War II happened, but she also observed that during the American Revolution and the Civil War, Uranus was in Gemini.
And also Uranus is going to go into Gemini in 2026, 27? Around
26, yeah. And something I found interesting too is she thought that the stock market crash was largely going to be because of she claimed it was because Jupiter would be making a menacing quote unquote planetary alignment with Uranus, and that's what she kind of thought would be like the impetus for the stock market crash. But it actually, so she thought 1927 to 1928 people should like watch their investments, but the stock market actually didn't crash until 1929. And when I was looking at the chart, I noticed that's when Venus and Uranus were conjunct. So she thought, oh, Jupiter and Uranus making a difficult aspect, she thought Jupiter was connected to wealth and assets. But I think honestly, that's more of a Venus thing. So it was interesting when it finally did crash, Uranus and Jupiter were in a square, but it was Uranus and Venus that were conjunct. So it had that kind of double stressful or hard aspect with Uranus, with Venus and Jupiter. And I was looking at, future charts for when we can kind of expect that to happen again. And I found that it's probably going to be May 2029 that we experience that again. Not only just like another war, because Uranus will be in Gemini, as she noted. This seems to be a pattern of when America, or the United States at least, goes into war. And Venus will be conjunct Uranus squaring Jupiter. So for my little kind of, based on kind of looking at some of her techniques and adding my own insight, I feel like that May 2029 is going to be like a very tumultuous United States year. And also we will have Neptune in Aries by then as well.
Yeah, great hit there. I mean, there's definitely talk about those years, 2029, 2030. There's a lot of interesting transits happening.
So I went on a little bit of a tangent, but ultimately she passed away in 1932. So let me pull the chart for her passage. I looked at just the plane transits and I didn't find so much, but then I noticed like, okay, let me look at progression, secondary progressions for her death date. And it was November 1932. And she passed away actually of a heart condition. It was like a heart disease that just came on like a few days before her actual death. So it wasn't something that a condition she like knew about, but she must have been looking at transits to maybe give some inkling what those transits were, whether she was looking at progress chart or using intuition or just plain transits. I'm not sure. But from my own understanding, and this is definitely a modern take because back in her day, Pluto was not yet discovered. So I'm definitely including a planet that she wouldn't have had the ability to utilize. But I noticed that on that date, by secondary progression, her death date, Pluto is squaring by exact degree her sun, her progressed sun in Aries. And we also have Uranus on her progressed sun. And Pluto is also opposing transiting Saturn in the 8th house, falling in her 8th house of death. So it was just something
that. Is it opposing Saturn or is it conjuncting Saturn?
Opposed.
Okay.
So these are just something I noted. Again, like we don't really know what exactly she was looking to, and it's not something that I do in my personal practice where no one's requested this of me yet to predict death. But it's something that we can look at after the fact if we're curious. And I'll pull her birth chart again, just so we can see, because a lot of medical astrologers say the 8th house is kind of a big clue.
It's a big clue, especially if other planets are connected to it. And then looking at her, if I may add this in real quick,
Sure.
Looking at her chart, the ruler of her chart with her ascendant in 23 degrees Pisces, we got to look careful at rulers. Plus, she's a day birth, which means the sun has more strength than the moon. So, I mean, is that what rulership are you surmising for her chart? Like, what's the planet that rules her chart?
Jupiter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying Jupiter. Is Jupiter making an aspect to the ascendant? It is. Well, it's a conjunction, but it's not that close. I'm just going through it because deciding what the power source of the chart is also attributed to what's the closest planet to the ascendant. And in this situation, we have Venus 2 degrees off the exact ascendant. So that's Venus is powerful too. So is Jupiter, so is the sun because it's a day birth. But the sun is not aspecting the ascendant. So and it's not aspecting those other planets. So I'm just, I'm just being all Virgo about what is the powerhouse of her chart. And then in your perspective, what's the significator of death? We don't need to go all into this, but you know what I mean? Just what do you see as to be honest,
I don't know if I believe there's just like one significator.
Got it.
Because I would think it could be a lot of transits that lead one to exit. I don't think it's just like one particular configuration is like the death. Because otherwise people would have
image is not showing completely, it's showing your computer also, just so you know.
I made it small intentionally so I can have her chart and then also the progression and the transit.
Got it. So you don't think it's a single planet that's the signifier of death? It's like a
No.
compendium of things, you think? Okay.
No, but I would say it's definitely probably hard outer planet transits to luminaries or to angles. I've seen trends of, like, you and I have talked about this in other videos, where when people have eclipses on luminaries or on hard angles and they've already been kind of in ill health, that can
Right.
be what takes them through that transition.
Right.
So
Talked about this, yeah.
it's like, to me, it's like there's like a perfect storm of things that can lead to death. But I would also argue you can have hard outer planet transits to personal planets like I've had in my life, and doesn't mean you're gonna die. But it's definitely something that if someone's having like an illness, you might look at the significator of that like illness and see if there's a hard transit to that planet in the chart. Wow, we only have 10 minutes left because of Zoom.
No, we're just doing your side. We'll do mine on another vid. It's fine.
Sure, okay. Unless I upgrade. How do I upgrade? Okay, that might be too involved. So yeah, that's kind of my take. Mostly I really wanted to just kind of express that she was a really impressive astrologer, and I believe she used a lot of case studies from clients she'd seen before. And I think she was a very intuitive, perceptive woman who came up with some of her own techniques. And so like, I don't know for sure why she was just like, could tell that she couldn't do that 21-day lecture, because she's like, I'm not going to be here that month. She just knew. She wasn't out sick at that time. It was like 3 days before her death. She came down with this like disease essentially of her heart, and then passed away pretty suddenly. So it wasn't like something she had been struggling with. And so that gives a little more validity to like, wow, she could see something or sense something.
I mean, people are still going to say, that, oh, like, she just, I mean, people can still say anything, that anyone can predict, anything, you know what I mean? But we have to keep in mind, and this is the important point, is that she was not a sickly person. Does that make sense? Like, she was healthy. And so for these astrologers to be able to predict their own death, and there's not any, thing that's going on already related to it, that's powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so too. And I like, just before we end this kind of first chapter of this conversation, I'm curious, like, Mario, what your personal stance on looking at quote unquote death charts or death predictions, if you think there's like a purpose to it personally, or if it's something you even had someone request. I'm curious.
I don't think we're gonna request. I mean, I know an astrologer who does in Europe, and he charges like he puts it on the age of the person. Like if they're under 30, he'll charge more because it requires more charts to go through. But I will reveal this. So last night, as I was going through my Grant Lewi research, because his death has to do with a solar eclipse on his sun, plus a new moon eclipse charging other planets that had that, like you said, were aspecting his 8th house and playing a role in that perfect storm in relationship to his death. I got into looking at all the eclipses for the next 20 years and for his year. And when I was getting into it, I was looking at where it was going to hit, my sun or something, or my moon. And I was seeing things. I was like, oh no, I don't want to know, right?
Right.
But,
ignorance is bliss, right?
Well, not really, because then I stepped back and I said, well, hold on, let me get a grip on this situation. And I said to myself, okay, let me ask myself a couple questions about if there are real significators of death that come around. So I said to myself, in my understanding in ancient astrology, Saturn is the signifier of death. And then I've been doing a lot of research on what is the ruling planet of a chart, and not in a simplified way of like, oh, this planet's in Pisces, so Neptune's the ruler. No, but in a complex way where I'm looking at, like the ancient astrologers did, I'm looking at the day. Is it a day birth or is it a night birth? Because if it's a night birth, the moon is stronger. If it's a day birth, the sun is stronger. And then really looking at the chart to see, okay, what's the real ruler in the chart? What's the Heilig, right? The Arabic term for the planet that, signifies death. Just really getting into it. And it's really not that simple. Like someone whose sun is not the ruler of their chart, they can go through an eclipse on their sun and all kinds of other stuff, and they'll make it through. Will they be exhausted the day before and have no energy? Yeah, I mean, probably, right? Is there going to be effects prior to the day of the eclipse? Sure. But is it going to kill them? Not likely. Like this is not a simple thing. This is like layers and layers and charts and charts. And this is why astrologers charge a lot for very precise work. Someone could say, and I've heard astrologers that have. I had a Bazi chart done, the Chinese astrology Bazi chart, and I've heard Bazi chart astrologers, they'll say, around this time. Of course, they're not going to give you a specific year, month, or day unless you ask for it and pay for it. And if they morally want to do that, I think it's a lot of energy. Just sorry to be so long-winded, but just to answer your question, I think it's a lot of energy. It's intense. I mean, already as an astrologer, you're kind of playing with fire when you look at transits,
Yes, that's a really good point. And then to what extent, the mystery always remains to what extent our free will is, because Evangeline, I know her stance was very much that it's like she has some quotes about like how some people play the victim to transits or life circumstances, and others rise to those occasions. Some of either the natal significators that give certain natal promise. Some people have horrible, challenging things in their chart. I don't want to say horrible, challenging things in their chart, and they make the best of it. And other people might have charts that show a lot of natal promise, but they're not fulfilling it because they're not co-creating with the energies. So I like her stance, and I agree with a lot of her stance that it's like it's what we make of it too. So when you start playing with fire and looking at things that maybe you don't necessarily look forward to, people have different philosophies. Some people do look forward to passing over, and maybe it's when you get older, it is something you look forward to. But for most younger people, it's not really something we're like planning or thinking about or wanting to put our minds at, because we're enjoying the moment of living here.
Yeah, there's an assumption and there's an entitlement. Oh, I deserve to live my life right now and have all this fun and stuff. But that's funny to me, because it's not even taking into account other incarnations, and the shit you did prior. Because if you've murdered people prior, you're that might happen to you in this lifetime. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's all possible. But I wanted to add to that. Do you know about what Yogananda would do, the Indian guru?
No.
In order to fuck with astrology, he would look at the worst transits to do something, and then he would do it.
Oh yeah, you told me that one time.
Yeah, he's a character. Yeah,
I think about that. I think about that.
Biography.
I think about that when I look at my own transits, and maybe fear comes up, or that could be an accident prone time. But then great, then astrology's maybe served its purpose because I have that heightened awareness. And it's always a practice to not fall into fear when looking at astrology. And that's where I think that like self-empowerment piece comes in, because we don't, like you or I or anyone, we don't really know how much free will we have in life. And that question probably will never.
I don't think we have any, to be honest.
Really?
I mean, I think there's something to say for gratitude and appreciation of what you have. I think that can transform things or communicate things to the higher self, or whatever higher, purpose is engaged, and what agreements are made in this lifetime. But I think it's pretty much not free will. I think everything's ordained and set up, and that's why omens have existed since the beginning of humanity. And humans watch and observe omens very carefully, because the world around us, everything reflects, refracts, and mirrors the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's a mirror play, and we're watching the play all the time, and it's reflecting back at us. Whether it's crows warning you, of something going to happen, they're warning of something, some kind of change and transformation. I mean, all astrology is just a symbolic language conveyed by the outer world and we're interpreting the symbols.
Mm,
But
interesting.
and human design would agree with that too. Human design is like no free will. We're in the vehicle and we're in for the ride. And the ride is what it is.
I'm gonna end with one of her quotes. I disagree, but I appreciate your stance. I think there is some degree of free will and choice. And otherwise, we are just kind of victim to seeing something play out that we're not acting in. But I kind of agree with Evangeline, and I'll leave you with her quote. She says, a horoscope can be compared to a moving picture which starts to unroll at the moment of birth. Just as in the motion picture world, there are films of Sunnybrook Farm type, those of the Charlie Chaplin type, and still others which portray the great events of the world. So in the case of people's lives, some individuals play just ordinary parts, others play comedy, furnishing bits of spice to life, while some are builders of great industry or organizers of artistic musical movements, and still others, by being impersonal and universal, help humanity to greater things